Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm just going to be, I'm going to prompt David because sometimes he gets shy and he doesn't want to talk. So my role is really just to do that. I'm not going to be talking much. I'm also going to hold the time quite closely because David doesn't want you to get bored. So we're going to go for about 90 minutes, and the way we're going to structure it is that we'll ask David a few questions. I've read the book before you guys, so I'm kind of going to prompt him in certain directions. We've had a conversation before. But before we do, and then of course we'll share equal time between the questions I have and the questions that you will have, right? So you will get a chance to talk. And I know many of you in the audience here, some of you have the moniker of Bishop behind your name. You can talk a lot, so I'll be watching you very carefully. Before we start, I'm going to call the respondent, not quite the respondent, Rod Riedlinger, to open up with his thoughts on collaborating with David on this project. I went online to check out who this guy was. And his Facebook page says that, and he told me today that he's a development editor and storyteller. He said, with more bounce than a bag full of tigers. And I was intrigued, so he pointed to his shoes, and you have to look at his shoes. He's got daisies on his tackies. So I'm totally intrigued to find out what he has to say. So he's responsible for the title of the book. It was his coining of the title, Conquest to Leaven. So Rod, can we give him a round of applause for Rod?
Wow, it's a big crowd for an editor who usually stays very far behind the scenes. I'm thrilled to have played a role in this book. I think it is a massively important book that is going to bear so much fruit. I was given this book to look at, and I was told a time frame, and I just wanted to crawl up in a corner and die because it's just not done that quickly. But when you read the content, this isn't a book that was done quickly. It's actually a culmination of an experience of life over a long period of a deep understanding of a situation, a troublesome, a challenging, and horrific situation that we see in our world that many of us don't understand very well. And where do you start? So I sat down and I read this book in one go. I do a lot of Ritalin, so I could do it in one sitting at my desk, and then I've read it a number of times subsequently, and I thought, this is a powerful book that we so badly need. And it got me thinking, because I knew very little about the situation. My work is diverse, as science fiction of Douglas Adams to business, to memoirs, to religious work. It's very diverse. And I didn't know a lot about this situation. And I thought, where do you even start to care and respond to a book like this, to a need like this? And immediately Thomas Pynchon's book came to mind, Gravity's Rainbow. There's a set of proverbs for paranoids where one of the characters reads them, and the third one is, if you get them to ask the wrong questions, you never have to worry about the answers. And that can so easily happen in an important scenario and situation. What are the right questions to ask? It's overwhelming. So the conquest happens when often we don't ask the questions because we don't even know where to start. This book is a wonderful place to actually become familiar with a situation that is frightening and unfamiliar to many of us, to get a solid understanding by a guide who is balanced, who cares, who is not afraid to call out injustice directly and go, this starts to make sense. I'm excited about this book because it does double duty as far as I'm concerned. It enlightens us and helps us become caring and responsive people to a crisis, but then turn it round and say, how can I prevent these sorts of things happening in my world? What philosophies do I cling to in ignorance and in pride? And then, what can I do? I'm a developmental editor and ghostwriter that sits behind a desk that most people never see. What can I do? And that made me kind of realize what was happening here is that Father was living there in that situation, and he's one person. That one person, that 1% can make the difference. And I can be that in my community if I care enough to make myself learn to ask the right questions with compassion and love and a bit of academic understanding. So this book was an absolute honor to work on and work with, and to see that all of us can be that 1%. You can be that thing that rises up in the flour, bread, and salt, that 1% that is kneaded and rubbed and folded into something that disappears, and you are responsible for it rising and giving life. And you might not make the history books or the front pages of The Economist or Time magazine or whatever you want to be on, but you were that catalyst within it because you were prepared to be a 1% that cared, anonymously sometimes and unrecognized. So I'm thrilled this book is out. I see this book just being involved in small Christian groups, learning about the situation, and then going forward to saying, how can we be the leaven in our community? So I'm excited there's so many of you here tonight, and I look forward to you all reading it and growing as much as I did as I worked on it with Father David. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So, thank you, Rod. He said he was nervous. He didn't look nervous at all. So perhaps I should invite David to come take a seat because, he's still getting mic'd. So let me do my brief introduction of our conversation today. I wrote a short paragraph. We live in a world of increasing polarization. There's no space for nuance. When you try to enter into dialogue to understand the other side, you're quickly identified or labeled as a sellout. People say you're an apologist for the other side. You place your credibility on the line when you argue for nuance. And this is not to say that we must treat the perpetrators of atrocities as normal interlocutors and not challenge their nefarious agendas. That most famous of South Africans, Nelson Mandela, opened dialogue with his jailers. Among the things he did in preparation for that was to get to know more about the community from which they came, including learning how to speak Afrikaans properly. I've always found that one gets a deeper understanding of the structural drivers of conflict when you physically are in a place, or when you engage very deeply with people who are from that place, who live in that place. So for me, Conquest to Leaven was a most compelling read. It led me to a deeper insight into the history of Israel-Palestine that explains much of the conflict that's happening today. It opened my eyes to see and get to know just a little about who lives there and how their experiences in politics have shaped the current situation. I found in the book that it's also in them that the hope for a genuine, peaceful alternative lies. So I'm really thrilled and I'm very honored that I get to facilitate a conversation with David, who is a Jewish South African who became a Jesuit priest and lives in Jerusalem. You really don't need anything else to promote the book, right? How did you end up in Jerusalem?
So is this working? You hear me?
No.
No. Now you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, that gave me time to think. I have to answer this very carefully for the unique reason that my mother is sitting in the second row. So how did I end up in Jerusalem? It was not a journey by choice. I was 15 years old. Things were a terrible mess here in South Africa. 1976 was 1 year before I left. 12 days before I left, Steve Biko was murdered. I had a big mouth, was a troublemaker. And in that kind of situation, I think my parents thought it's best that I go somewhere far away. There were too many possibilities of getting into trouble. And so being a pupil in King David Linksfield High School, it wasn't so complicated to send me off to what was called Ulpan, a kind of Zionist brainwashing program to go to Israel and hopefully fall in love with Jewish Israel and move there. And so off I went, not very happy, but what happened just a few days after arriving was I fell in love, deeply in love with Jerusalem, and didn't want to leave. So a total turnaround. And so then it was just to wait for the opportunity. I spent over 3 months in 1977 in Jerusalem, was able to maneuver my way back for another 2 months in 78, and in the end of 79 finished matric here in South Africa, and as soon as I could got back to Jerusalem and stayed there. I've been living there ever since.
Okay. While you were there, you befriended Osama. You called him your closest friend. You became family, you shared a connection that throughout the book you can sense that connection is indivisible to your own faith journey. What made that so fundamental in your formation?
So I met Osama almost as soon as I arrived. And Osama was one of the revolutions that happened to me arriving in Jerusalem. Perhaps I need to explain that Osama is not a Jewish Hebrew name. Osama is an Arab name. And my first friend, I truly believe now, I didn't have much faith back then, but truly believe now that God was writing the story. Osama is a very religious Muslim, a teacher, for many years the principal of a school in Jerusalem, but we were both very young at the time, and listening to him, just knowing the name Osama and the person who stood in front of me kind of shattered the myths that I had learnt, that this was my land. We, the Jews, had the right to be here. And if there was anyone else claiming to be somebody in this land, they must be my enemy. And Osama became my best friend. Of course, on the religious level and on the national level, that was a real shaking up. In Arabic, shaking up is intifada. And this was before the first intifada. This was my intifada. I'll just give one story, and it's in the book, so afterwards you can hand back your books because you will have heard it all. But it was one of those wake-up moments that just came one after the other. Sitting, by the way, when Osama recognized that I was alone in Jerusalem with no family, he said, "What? How can one live with no family? Come with me." And he introduced me to Abu Osama and Osama, father of Osama and mother of Osama. And they became like second parents to me. And one day, in those early days, sitting in the kitchen with Usama, she's mightily responsible for me speaking Arabic because that's the only language she could speak. So if I wanted to speak to my second mother, I had to learn Arabic. Sitting in the kitchen with her, chatting, Yahya came home. Yahya was her grandson. And he was singing a kind of nationalist song. And I understood most of the words, and they weren't very complimentary about my people. So Usama turned to Yahya and she said to him, "How can you speak like that?" And Yahya said, "Why can't I speak like that? They are throwing tear gas bombs at us and shooting us. And why can't I say that?" So she said, "Yahya, David is Jewish." And he looked at me suddenly with big eyes and looked at his grandma and he said, "Grandma, nonsense. David's not Jewish." And Usama said, "No, David is Jewish." And he said, "Nonsense, Grandma. He doesn't wear green clothes." And I thought, what? And then I realized that for somebody like Yahya, Jews were soldiers, or maybe settlers, or policemen, but certainly not ordinary people. And so that was another wake-up moment, another discovery of a Jerusalem, of a Palestine that I had not been educated to know, and so discovered step by step on this journey of friendship with Usama.
David also writes about the conversations and the arguments and the exploration of religious texts of the major monotheist religions, and with these friends, Osama included. Yeah, I don't suppose we would have done it over a bottle of wine or something like that. So thanks for that, David. Now, military conscription, that was one of the reasons your folks wanted you out of the country, right? But you ended up in an Israeli military prison for refusing to serve. And you talk about some of the engagements with the characters that were also deprived of their freedom. Just share some of those insights and how that also contributed to your journey.
So that was another waking up, but it was a waking up on a completely different level, because in the book I try to describe the complexity of the Jewish world, and the Jewish world out of which I came was what we call the Ashkenazi Jewish world, the Jewish world of European Jewry, with all of that it entails. Centuries of living in the margins, often persecuted, discriminated against, and then of course in the 20th century that reaching a peak in the Shoah. So that is a very definite part of my history. And finding myself in prison where the only Ashkenazi would have been the head of the prison. Everyone else was what I would call, and what I do call in the book, Jewish Arabs, meaning Jews who came from Arab countries, Jews who had had a very different history than we did as Ashkenazim. They had come from countries stretching from Morocco all the way to Iraq, and had been part and parcel of societies that were Muslim societies. And so, with a very different history. And my time in prison, because, and this is very unfortunate in Israeli society, there's a whole chapter about Jewish Arabs in the book. The Jewish Arabs were brought to Israel. After 1948, of course, it became very difficult to be a Jew in an Arab country because the Jews were seen as the enemy. And so almost 1 million Jews were displaced from the Arab countries. They are secondary victims of what happened in 1948, the first victims being the Palestinian Arabs. The secondary victims are the Jewish Arabs. And they were moved off to Israel, accepted to some degree with incredible discrimination. And until today, there is still not social equality within the Jewish population. And so, yes, I was in prison with people who were mostly dropouts, delinquents, petty criminals who were in a military prison because they too had run into trouble during their army service or had tried to get out of army service and had been slapped into prison. And so I met this unknown population. And I remember one very, very intense conversation with a young man, Moroccan family, who hated Arabs. And one day I said to him, "But aren't you an Arab?" Of course, I knew that would set him off. And he said, "I'm a Jew." And I said, "What language did your parents speak at home?" And that set off something else in him, memories of stories that he had heard from his parents about life in Morocco. And reminiscing about that, he then told me a story that again was paradigmatic for my understanding of what goes on in Israel. He said that one day he came from a development town in the south of Israel. He decided to go to Jerusalem to go to the Western Wall. He was not particularly religious, but he thought it would be a fun adventure, and as a Jew he would go and visit the site of our forefathers where we have been praying for thousands of years. And off he went to the Western Wall. And going through Damascus Gate, he was pulled aside by soldiers who had lined up a whole group of Arab young men against the wall with their hands in the air, their feet spread apart, and they had collected all of their identity cards. And he grabbed this young man and said, go stand there in Arabic. Ta'al, ruh hunak. And this young man, who knew enough Arabic to understand, said, F off. And the soldier, of course, went wild and took him and smashed his face into the wall so that he was full of blood. And he was shouting, "I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish." And the soldier, only when he took his identity card out of his pocket by force, discovered that he was Jewish and shamefacedly sent him on his way. So I said, what does that do to you? And I think it might have been the first time that he reflected on the possibility of perhaps there was something in his identity that linked him to the Palestinians who live in Israel. But again, our identities are so constructed, so artificial, and so weaponized.
Yeah. You know, this part of the section was kind of getting a biographical background to who David is. But you can see how indivisible the context, the community within which you are, you're indivisible from that. And so as you're telling us about who you are, you're giving us an insight into the situation there. So I know I've had a question about your ordination, and you can talk about it perhaps later, but there's a lot of other questions which I think I want us to get a bit our hands dirty with. So thanks, David, for those really interesting and moving stories. I picked up equality, justice, and peace as a recurring theme. So I was reading it. I had to suspend sometimes the emotion that came with it because I knew I'd have to be quite on point, you know, in the moderator. So I was looking for the themes, and that was quite clear. I didn't have to look very hard. And those are the themes that I think shape all the conversations in the different chapters that you have. And one of them is around land. And when we were preparing, David said, don't do any comparison with South Africa. I haven't lived here for long enough. Let's talk about the land question, that side. And I think most of us would have encountered the land question or the justification of the establishment of the State of Israel as the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, right? Where Israel would live out the covenantal relationship with God in observing the Torah. But then you go to Leviticus and you say that the land is God's and we are but tenants. You quote Benedict, Pope Benedict. Gotta watch my decorum here. Conquerors come and go, but the ones who remain are the simple, the humble, who cultivate the land and continue sowing and harvesting in the midst of sorrows and joys. So tell us about this the theological justifications, imperial occupation agendas, and land in Palestine, Israel.
So again, I want to bring the conversation back, answering your question, to the question of equality. I think that a lot of the discourse about Palestine-Israel focuses around justice and peace. But I think that we need to start with equality, and perhaps, again, I write in the beginning of the book, all writing is autobiographical, however scientific it pretends to be. It's always the writer bringing the writer's self into the writing. And I think that this might be how much I've been influenced by the struggle in South Africa, the struggle against apartheid, that I became so much aware of the lack of equality in the land. So I think that the book says that the Jews are certainly connected to that land. There is a connection that is undeniable. Jews have always somehow identified with at least a longing for that land. Through the centuries, very, very few Jews ever went there, and it was almost like some kind of heavenly Jerusalem. I think that in the 19th century, with the genesis of Jewish nationalism, that link became a national link, a nationalist link, and I have a lot of critique about how that happened, why it happened, and how we need to think of that differently now. But I'm making the claim in the book that Jews do not have any kind of monopoly on that land. That there is a people that has always lived there, and that people has as much of a right to be there as the Jewish people. Now, of course, if I would be up against, and maybe some people in the audience think like this, are people who rip biblical verses out of the Bible in order to plaster them onto modern realities, and we know they do that in lots of different contexts when it comes to women or LGBT or any of a number of struggles in our modern world, then I would be up against fierce opposition saying God gave this land to the Jews and anyone else there is second class. The book argues that that is not the way that we as Christians can think. And I would say that it is not the way that many, many Jews think. I think that there is an awakening that is broadening and widening, that there is something in that exclusivist claim to the land based upon biblical texts and nationalist ardor that is dehumanizing. First and foremost, dehumanizing for the people who are then relegated to second-class state or worse. And in the last few years, we've seen what that worse looks like. And it is dehumanizing for the occupier, for the person carrying out that discrimination, because there is no humanity in that. And I think God wants us first and foremost to be humans. So, did I answer the question?
You went into the next question as well. It's making my life difficult here. No, but I think in the book you describe all the component parts of society there, all the different communities and their historical. So the next question related to discrimination, but I think you've eloquently answered that. But you also described your book. Everything you read, there's always, always, always a line of hope that's coming through. So it's not just description of a bad situation for its own sake. In everything you write, you're talking about, so how does this contribute to the possibilities of a future? And if you don't believe me, I'm going to read a quote from the book where David writes, "Remembering the Jews of the Arab worlds and their history defines in forgotten ways the words Jew and Arab, opening new horizons towards a future that is not suffocated by present realities of conflict and dispossession. The present stagnates, hovering over an unbridgeable abyss between the two, but evoking a time before Jews against Arabs. The memory of Jews at home in Arabic proffers the perspective of a future where Jews might dwell alongside Arabs in a just peace and reconciled equality. I had to put that in. It's just the most beautiful thing that I came across. You've just described some of the ugliness of the apartheid that exists there. How do you reconcile that? Because you go through all the different communities and I feel like I know them in ways that I wouldn't otherwise have.
I think that the very explicit attempt in the book in delineating certain groups within society, both Palestinian society, but even more in Israeli society, is to say, where can the wall be chipped? Where are the cracks that could be opened up, finally bringing down the wall? And so in the book I'm describing there is a chapter on each of these 4 components in Israeli society. The ultra-Orthodox Jewish world that never really went through this nationalization of consciousness. They remained very, very rooted in a very different understanding of what it means to be Jewish. The Jewish Arabs, the Jews, look at my fingers, the Jews from Russia and the ex-Soviet Union. People who were brought over with very little identification with the Jewish world, but were brought over because they would be assimilated into the Jewish world and adopt a lot of the ideology that is foundational to the Israeli state. There again I see cracks that might be widened and bring the wall down. And the 4th group, which is the clearest, are Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel, about 2 million people in a country made up of 9 million people. I'm talking about the international borders of the State of Israel. So these groups, which are big parts of the population, are not speaking always the same language that we hear from the Prime Minister and the ministers of the Israeli government. They are not speaking perhaps a language of openness, equality, justice and peace. But I'm looking for seeds that might grow into something different if change was at least partially visible on the horizon. And so that's the attempt. When you talk about hope, the exercise in the book is saying really basically, we don't have any hope right now. I'll share with you an anecdote that's not in the book, and please, I'm not sure who's sitting right, don't repeat the story. But we are receiving a visit from one of our major superiors in the next few days. And his press officer wrote to me and said, well, you're going to set up a meeting for him. Could you tell us how this is going to bring more hope out of his visit? And I said, go to hell. I'm here to present our situation, not so that you can go back home and say, we found hope. But nonetheless, I'll say something about hope. I think that we have this idea that hope is something in the future. We can see something way there on the horizon that looks hopeful. Let me assure you, there's a wall. There's darkness. It's walled off. Most of us don't see anything on the horizon. So I became aware that in the biblical experience, hope is because of something that we had in the past. There's a hope that is based upon looking backwards. From a religious point of view, it's the hope of having encountered God. We don't feel God's presence right now, but we know that we have encountered God. There is something that keeps us going because of the power of that encounter. And it means that in order to hope, I have to remember. And so I apply that also sociologically and politically and historically. And here it's shattering one of the major myths that our political leadership vehicles. It's always been like this. It will always be like this. So the best we can do right now is manage it, meaning the conflict. Repression, discrimination, genocide, whatever we need to do, well, it's because it's always been like this and will always be like this. This is the lie. No, it hasn't always been like this. So going to those communities and trying to understand how do they conceive of their past. That young man in prison suddenly realizing that if he remembered a time when his grandparents lived with Arabs, spoke Arabic, were part and parcel of the Arab world, could that open a future when people would speak Arabic and be part of the Arab world? This is one of the terrifying things, I don't even know if I mention it in the book, but close to half of Jewish Israelis had grandparents whose mother tongue was Arabic. Today, not even 1% of the Jewish Israeli population can have a regular conversation in Arabic. We stomped out the language because they were the enemy. Well, for that young man's grandparents, they were not the enemy, they were the neighbors. And they participated in a society that was rich and built by, yes, a Muslim civilization, but with a huge part played by Jews and Christians. So the past, no, it hasn't always been like this. And that means it doesn't always need to be like this.
Yeah, so we're going to stop now with my questions, but I just wanted to, because you went into that, the postlude in the book is where you write about prophetic imagination. And you talk about the prophetic perspective that comes from those on the margins. And particular talking there about the Palestinian Christians. And I think that's the leaven that is in your title, that you'll find it in the places not where powerful men with bad agendas gather, but where ordinary people who are far removed from the center challenge us to a different form of prophetic behavior. And then the question I was going to ask, which I think you've already answered, and then I'm going to give it over to questions. And I was going to quote the Justice and Peace Commission's statement on what a legitimate solution looks like. But you say, hope, you write about a hope that is an act of faith. That is the conviction that God desires good for humanity. And I think that I don't know if you want to comment on that, or if that would, because that's the last thing I have to say, really. You've kind of said everything that I picked up in the book, and we'll open it up to questions.
So just perhaps one last word about that God desires good, and that we are called to preach good news. If the Bible is bad news for anyone, then it's not the Word of God. The Bible must be good news. And of course that's complex. I'm not saying something simplistic. But if the Bible is a word of condemnation, a word of expulsion, a word of occupation, a word of discrimination, or worst of all, a word of genocide, we cannot hold that up and say the Word of God.
I think a round of applause. So I think I can carry on talking to David, but that's not why you came. So you must have some questions as well, or some comments.
So the microphone will be brought to you.
Yeah.
We have KG and Swazi, our wonderful media team, and they'll be able to bring a mic.
Thank you, Father David. I absolutely enjoyed what you have told us. What you just said about hope, can Israel and the Palestinians not look back? And if I can ask this question, and I don't know if it's naive, Ishmael and Isaac are brothers, and they not look all the way back.
So I would say definitely you're getting into the exercise. I would also say that you don't need to look back as far as Isaac and Ishmael. The contours of separation without hope of coming together were sketched out in the 1930s. There is an Israeli historian who has produced wonderful works on the history of Palestine, Israel, by the name of Hillel Cohen, and many others as well, who have defined the formative moment of the conflict, meaning the time of divide and then little hope of coming together again, as the 1930s. By going through, another historian, going through letters, diaries of both Jews and Arabs in the 1920s, and recognizing that until then still there was some kind of common society, some kind of common horizon. That fell apart in the 1930s. So, yeah, we don't even need to go back as far as Isaac and Ishmael to find testimonies of being together.
Is a hand here? It might be nice if you told us your name and
my name is Glenn Osher. I'm also from a Jewish background. And my question was, it said that I met Jesus 36 years ago. And my one question was, how did you find him? From King David, my brother. And then, how was your experience being amongst the precious Muslims when it comes to the New Testament and the crucifixion of Jesus and so on?
So very briefly, I was also a little surprised that Ashley didn't ask me that question. You'll find more details in the book. I'll say very, very briefly, but I say it with intensity, that when I went to Jerusalem, I didn't know God. I'm not sure how I defined myself. If I said I was an atheist or an agnostic, didn't interest me, the question. And in Jerusalem, I met a Russian Orthodox nun, 89 years old, paralyzed from the waist down. And I went to see her, nothing to do with religion. Religion did not interest me. But after spending 3 hours in her company, I came away with the sensation that I had met joy. And it didn't make any sense because 89-year-old nun, paralyzed from the waist down, seemed to me a dictionary definition of depression. So I went back to see her a week later and I said, I don't understand. Joy? What is joy? And she, who knew full well that I was a 15-year-old Jewish boy, did not want to engage me on this. But I pushed and pushed and pushed, and finally she said, I'm in love. I said, okay. She's completely crazy. And the next word was Jesus. So that was the encounter. It took many, many years of journeying, but the one constant was Jesus. Usama came just a year or two after that. Her name was Mother Barbara. You'll meet her in the book. I have never felt the urge to proselytize. I feel that the only mission that I have is to try to live a life based upon the joy of the resurrection in a world that is so sad. But to notice that for reasons I don't understand, I meet Jewish people and Muslim people who are full of joy. And Usama is one of the most joy-filled persons that I know. So I have studied the Quran with Usama. I have gone to pray with Usama in the mosque, and it has opened my horizons in an incredible way. recognizing now that I believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But somehow, and I'm not God, Usama knows the way, the truth, and the life without naming it Jesus. And I wouldn't be able to say much more than that, other than I know that.
Thanks, Steve. You noted the microphone is all the way in the back there.
Oh, somebody's
I knew
coming
somebody
right
would ask the question. That's why I did. Sunny.
Hi, Sunny.
No, mic's not on.
Sunny, you have a loud voice. You can shout.
But for recording.
Thank you for inviting me once again. It's my fourth attendance at the talk.
No, we can't
No,
hear.
Sunny, come to the front. KG, we cannot hear.
You've got to put your mic off. There we go. Yeah.
Oh.
So, Father David, thank you to the Jesuit Institute and to you for the invite. It's my fourth time. And I come regularly because you teach well and you tell the truth. So I'm an activist, and two things occupy me. The freedom of the Palestinians and the work that we do, and the climate crisis. But I'm also the climate crisis. I just come back from Brazil a few hours ago. But I'm also a Christian, and I want to do some of the work because in the Palestinian work we do petitions, write poetry, write op-eds, do articles, and even promote the boycott of PES. But there's this whole untapped area of work that we can't seem to have a breakthrough in, and that's in the Christian community. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how we can make that connection, because in our work we are in an organization called South African Christians for Palestine, and it's not growing because the message is not landing, and in fact we have a lot of opposition. So if you can give us some guidance about how to structure our work in the Christian community, because I've been told that I'm doing dangerous work because we've been kicked out of certain churches for bringing this message, and a pastor has told me to watch out because I'm in trouble already. I don't know what that means, but please guide us.
So of course, Sunny, I don't know your context, so I'm going to dive in and maybe be completely off key. But I'd like to briefly mention 4 things that I think are the obstacle to us, because I see you and me on the same side of the barricade. The obstacles, and I think there are 4, to getting our message across. So, obstacle number one is the word Bible. I think that we really need, and I don't know if that's you because you define yourself as an activist, but it's certainly me because I define myself as a teacher of the Bible. We need to start reading the Bible after the destruction of Gaza. We need to recognize that there is something in how we've taught the Bible, how we speak about the Bible, that has facilitated the genocide that has gone on. So that's point number one. These are challenges, not answers. Point number 2 is the word Jew. And I think that, and I rejoice in this, the white person's world has woken up to its own toxic attitude to the word Jew that led to the Shoah. But the terrible thing is that the shadow side of that salvific waking up means that now empowered Jews can use that sensitivity to completely neutralize any talk about Palestinians or Palestine or freedom or ending occupation or ending discrimination. Because, of course, what I'm referring to is the conflation now with a real anti-Semitism that exists. with a justified, legitimate critique of the state of Israel and the ideology of Zionism. By the way, Sunny, the first chapter in the book deals exactly with that. It's called Anti-Semitism and Palestine. Okay? The word number 3 is Muslim or Islam. It seems that our world can't do without hating something or someone. So we've very adeptly, deftly switched Jews and Judaism with Muslims and Islam. And our horrendous, horrific teaching of contempt is now directed toward Muslims, and so we can portray the state of Israel as being that last barricade against the hordes of Islam that are going to come and invade us and murder us, etc., etc., etc. Now let's just be very clear. I'm not saying that Muslims are angels that have dropped out of heaven. Muslims are just like us. They're good guys and they're bad guys. They're wonderful partners in dialogue, and they're violent terrorists. Just like us. We never forget that, just like us. Okay? So that's the third thing that we need to work on. And the fourth thing, and I say this again with a little bit of fear and trembling, because sitting in the audience is the son of my old history teacher who set me on this kind of thinking. His name was Donovan Lowry, his son Stephen Lowry, and his daughter is also sitting here. We are still stuck in colonial ways of thinking. We still, as much as we're trying to throw it off, we haven't. And when it comes to Palestine, it kicks in big. So again, let's repeat those 4 words, and I think we need to do a lot of work. Bible, Jews, Muslims, colonialism. And those are, I think, very potent obstacles in getting our message out.
As a proper revolutionary teacher, you don't give answers, you ask people to ask questions. Steve.
Thanks, Stephen Lowry. David, you spoke about needing to look back to be able to remember, to find a source of hope. And I have to say that in the last 2 or 3 years, with Palestine and Trump as 2 world events, I find it very difficult to find hope. And I have sometimes felt that, in fact, our world was far safer pre-1989. And the fall of the wall, and when the 2 ideologies were at war with one another, we had the balance of terror under which we were safer. I don't know if that's really what we're looking for as a sign of hope.
Yes, I don't think that all of history is full of hope. But I do think that looking back and identifying those moments of experiencing relationship. Again, you need to scratch a lot. And again, I'm going back to the specifics of Israel-Palestine. Again, in the book, I tell an anecdote. And again, it's about remembering. It was one of the Jewish feasts. It was the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. The Israelis had shut down the Palestinian territories, imposed military curfew on the Palestinian areas. Palestinians were not allowed into Israel, and that meant not allowed even into occupied Jerusalem. And I, protected by my priestly cassock, had driven over the boundary to teach in the area of Bethlehem at the seminary, and I was driving back, full cassock. And there's no one around. I cross through the checkpoint with very little difficulty. The Israelis see that I'm a priest. They, if need be, look at my Vatican laissez-passer. And as I get to the other side, just a little beyond where the soldiers were, I see an old Palestinian woman walking. No one is around, with a huge basket of fruit on her head. So I thought, where is she going? So I stopped the car. And in Arabic I said, "Grandmother, where are you going?" And she said, "I have to get to Damascus Gate, miles away. I have to get to the old city so I can sell the fruit because it's going to go off." And I said, "Grandmother, how did they let you pass the soldiers?" And she said, "You know, I'm old." So I insisted, and I said, I sat down, I wouldn't move, so I said, "Go." And so she started to walk. This was about 10:30, 11 in the morning. So I said, "Grandmother, come, get into the car, I'll take you to Jerusalem." And I said, "Let me play a little game." I said, "Grandmother, why is everything closed down?" And the way she began opened for me again a whole new way of thinking. She said, "My son, you're too young to remember." Memory. I said, "Grandmother, remember what?" And she said, "When I was a child, we lived with them." She's just been harassed by the soldiers, abused, walking all the way for miles to try and sell fruit. And she's telling me about them. And I said, "What do you mean? What's going on?" She started to tell me, and for the next 15 minutes told me in detail about the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and what they do on the Feast of Tabernacles. "You're too young to remember. We used to go to them, and they used to come to us. We used to live together." Again, it's not some kind of idyllic past. But this woman had experienced something real that her children and grandchildren wouldn't have a clue about. And here was I, the age of her grandchild, and she's telling me about Sukkot. This is the remembering of a relationship that opens up a horizon that we have done everything we can to shut off with walls and military barriers and checkpoints. And this woman's memory could enter into the world of the other in a way that, like the young man remembering what his grandparents had told him about Morocco, it opens up another world. It's a prophetic imagination that brings a language of relationship in a time of total brokenness. And it's something very small and fragile, like leaven, but that can help get the dough to rise. So I think that's what I mean when I talk about remembering.
You talk about a relationship that motivates and invigorates in the book. And I think that's what you're talking about. That's the leaven that we are called to have in our relationships. There's a question there with my roving mic. We're doing well with time. We've got about 5 minutes left. Is that okay with you, David?
Look at the faces of your audience.
I see rapt attention is what I see. So there's two hands there, a gentleman behind and, yeah. Put off there. It's not off.
It's not done.
It's on.
Oh.
So I read your book in the hope of finding some kind of hope. It was about 6 days ago at the Institute. I said, "Have you got the book yet?" They said, "Yes." I came to fetch a copy. What fascinated me is you obviously come from a background of the kind of background that I'm used to. I'm a white South African. I went to school here. I had a lot of Jewish kids who were my friends. They talked about the kinds of things they went through and when they were sent to understand their background, particularly the Holocaust, the background of grandparents who'd been suffered through the kind of things that happened then. And I was trying to struggle through, what do we do now? I've also been obviously part of a population that's been watching a genocide happening on TV and horrified, trying to work out what can we do in this situation. The more I respond to it and engage in various ways and talk to people about it, the more the reaction I get is this conflict has been going on for thousands of years. This is the Holy Land you're talking about. What do we talk about? Where's the solution? What do you actually suggest we do in this situation? So the challenge from lots of friends is basically either from the Jewish side, are you seriously saying that we must just give up and kind of hand over? Are you seriously suggesting that we would have a society where everybody has a vote, which would basically mean destruction of us? It sounded incredibly similar to the background that we faced in South Africa when we took part in the kind of struggle to try and say, how can we change things here? From Christians, it's kind of, but this is the Holy Land you're talking about. These are the people of God, the chosen people of God. How can you stand against them? So I read your book thinking, okay, well, there must be, this guy lives through this. He's basically living with the people who are kind of facing this reality every day. What kind of hope is there for us for the future? I found really fascinating the cultural stuff, the stuff that you brought to the forefront about kind of Arabic culture, the ways in which the Jewish people who did actually live in that part of the world were actually part of a single culture. But what horrified me, and forgive me that you actually reflected in some ways too, is that people who talk about it and talk about the land, you answered the question about land by saying the two sides have a kind of equal claim on the land. I don't see it like that at all. How could you have an equal claim on land when the one side lived there and the other side was brought in there to take over the land from them, chucked them out, chased them out of their homes, took over the population, basically took over the state, persecuted them. Now in that situation, how do you bring those two sides to some kind of united, rosy future? What sort of things should we be striving for? I mean, I was fascinated with your book, and I think, congratulate you on it, but in terms of hope, I'm not sure.
Thank you for that question. And I think it's very interesting to reflect on that question here in South Africa. You said, I am a white South African. What can South Africa teach Palestine, Israel? We have gone through lots of struggles that are called settler colonial struggles. And I think, and here again, I'm not an expert in this, I think many of those struggles would be focused on the rights of an indigenous people and a settler population that has a motherland to return to. I'm thinking of the Pied Noir in Algeria. Go home, okay? What is particular to white South Africa and Palestine, Israel, is that the population that engaged in settler colonial strategies to disenfranchise the indigenous people does not have a homeland to go back to. You're still here. And I'm hoping that most of the white faces I see here who are South African say, we are South Africans. We are Africans. Well, you came from Europe at some point, but a kind of indigenization came about, good, bad, indifferent. I think that this is something that we have to deal with in Palestine, Israel. It's interesting, something contradicts what I'm saying, and that is that there is now a frenzy among Jewish Israelis to reclaim passports from the countries from which their ancestors came. So running to the Lithuanian embassy, the Polish embassy, the German embassy to get passports. That fits in with a kind of realization that maybe we aren't as well rooted here as we pretended to be, as Zionism claimed that we were. But let's remember there are now 7 million Jews in Israel. There are about 7 million Palestinian Arabs who have remained sumud. They've remained in their land. There are more of them in the exile, in the diaspora, than in Palestine. I think that any contemplation of coming to some new horizon means recognizing that those who have engaged in settler colonialism, meaning Jewish Israelis, in the very terms that you described, are part and parcel of the future. And coming to terms with that is, I think, some of what many Palestinians are doing very, very courageously. Recognizing that, yes, and therefore it becomes so very important to say they do not have any more rights than the Palestinians, because that's the discourse, that's the narrative that you yourself use the Bible. But it's not just the Bible. It's a kind of language of 19th century nationalism that has legitimized Zionism as a form of nationalism rather than a form of settler colonialism. So I agree with your difficult analysis. But I think that, again, South Africa has something to teach, because there were enough black South Africans, despite the horrors of what they experienced during apartheid time, who said, no, you are here, and this is our reality, and the way forward is to create a society together. I think that's what I'm also proposing in the book. And I hope that I'm not wrong. It's only a hope.
Now, Peter, hands are waking up. So I'm going to take the last, you guys. So there's 3 hands there and then 1 here, then we're done, right? Is that okay?
Are they women's voices?
There's one woman. No, Mukesh isn't a woman. All right, so
KG, bring the microphone to Terry.
I think I'd recognize the gentleman there.
No, yes, here.
2 rows back.
Here we have a lady speaking.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Hi, Ranjani.
Father, I wanted to ask, what does real resistance that helps the Palestinian cause look like? Because I feel that some of the things that we do here is about making ourselves feel better. Sometimes it's about showmanship. Sometimes it's about a false sense of solidarity. So what would real solidarity look like that the Palestinians would feel and that would help them in their cause? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Because it gives me the opportunity to say, as somebody coming from there, an Israeli citizen, deeply in solidarity with Palestinian brothers and sisters, to say thank you to South Africa. Because you're asking a question, I think that every Palestinian feels a sense of gratitude towards South Africa for what South Africa has done in the last 2 years and paid for it dearly. G20 without Mr. Trump. I was happy that he wasn't around, but he might claim it was to do with imaginary Afrikaner genocide, but it had more to do with the fact that South Africa has resisted the American foreign policy on Israel. So thank you for that. I do say in the book that, of course, there are those that will go off and join the Palestinian resistance, which is not sworn to non-violence. There is a form of non-violent resistance, and that's something else that we learned from the South African experience, and it's called BDS. And to make an individual choice, as well as a group choice, as well as a community choice, and hopefully eventually a national choice to boycott, disinvest, and sanction. Because it's very unfortunate. The people in Israel, and they are there, and the people in the Jewish world, and they are even more numerously there, who are absolutely convinced that there is no future for us as Jews without guaranteeing the welfare of the Palestinian people, are still very few. And therefore, we have a way of saying we won't buy into this. And I think that that is something that needs to be sharpened. But again, I know how much South Africa has already paid and is paying for its courageous position. So thank you for that. Terry, you will definitely have the voice.
No, my sister spoke it and also.
Okay.
I've got one more woman's voice here. So there's solidarity.
I don't know.
Good evening,
Yes.
everyone. Father David, I think when it was introduced, the launch of the book, how it doesn't matter what knowledge you have about this current situation of Palestine and Israel. And most importantly, I just wanted to say that obviously all the questions will be very academic and, but I'm from Alexandra. I want to stress that because I wouldn't have that knowledge about this current situation. And our parish priest took a few of us to try and open our minds to the reality of the world, that we cannot just be in this particular place and not open our minds to the world. So I thought maybe I should just say, even when one comes from a place like that, we do take interest in these world affairs, and thanks to our parish priest who insists that we have to open our minds to. My question, Father David, is that you talked about history and you also talked about memory, which then feeds the joy of the people. And the gentleman who travels from Brazil and was saying about Christians and how we seem not to be getting involved in this situation. And based on those two things, what I wanted to ask from you, Father David, is that if history feeds joy and the fear of this gentleman that Christians, we are not helping that much in this situation, what I wanted to find out from you is that history, I remember there was a time, I think it's Benjamin Netanyahu, he asked Pope Francis a question, and the question was that he answered that Jesus spoke Jewish, and Pope Francis said no, he spoke Aramaic. So why then can the church not maybe use Aramaic, since history and joy are the things that seem to give us that hope? So maybe in some of the prayers we can say this is our history, the Aramaic language. And to yourself, maybe Father David, to add hope to the situation, maybe you must take some of your prayers in Aramaic to say this is our history, this is what may feed joy.
Thank you.
And yeah, that's my question, Father David.
So first of all, I think that you are asking us also to say a word of thank you to Father Jeffrey, who brought parishioners from St. Hubert in Alexander Township. Thank you very much for coming. I want to tell you that you do say something in Aramaic, and it's a very important prayer. And it's right at the end of the New Testament. And it's the word Maranatha. That's Aramaic. And I think that that is our most ardent prayer. Maranatha, come, our Lord. Come, our Lord. For we live in this vale of tears and we want to be redeemed. So you and I, when we meet each other, and we've met each other a few times, let's greet each other with that. A memory of an Aramaic-speaking Jesus. Do you remember the story that this man is referring to? Do you remember what happened? Pope Francis came to Jerusalem in 2014, and he sat in a conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu. It's very significant. And Benjamin Netanyahu tried to manipulate the Pope by saying, your God spoke our language. Your God spoke Hebrew like I speak Hebrew, which is already an incredible manipulation. Pope Francis knew what was going on. And he said, no. Our Lord spoke Aramaic, rejecting that kind of attempt to manipulate the situation, which is part of the obstacle that I think Sunny was talking about of how can we resist this? This is the people of Jesus. Jesus would have been an IDF soldier. Jesus would have participated in the destruction of Gaza. We must be on our guard, and we all can be on our guard about that. So, thank you for that question.
Thank you. Shall we take one more?
One more.
And then we'll wrap up. Okay, two more, and then we'll wrap up.
Good evening. My name is Tabile.
I'm really grateful to be here, and also I just want to touch some few points. And Father David, you know, what you were sharing, it was an eye-opener for us, especially for me, because these days people, we are self-centered, and whatever we want to do or what we just look into what is there for me. It's not what is there for people. So for you to allow yourself to experience both lives, South Africa and in Palestine and also in Israel, it was not an easy journey, as you were just sharing, but to me it opened another part of the book, that it's giving us more clarity, because sometimes you see in the media or you hear people saying this, but you don't get the juicy story as we get it from you, taking us from, you know, detailed. As I'm saying, sometimes we think that when we are silent and then you are a good person, of which you are betraying solidarity, because you need to do something as you have acted. I think we need to applaud you and say, we thank God about your life, because your life showed us that humanity, it comes first than whatever you have achieved and whatever you were doing. But how you portray yourself, how you do things, you allow yourself to go through all that. But the other thing that I just want to wrap up about, identity. Because we want to find ourselves, we are partially, you know, as African, your mother is a Sotho, your dad is a whatever, and you are a mixture of part and parcel of what. So you want to classify yourself as, I'm more comfortable with this group, I'm more comfortable. You really don't have a stand, but you want to take this stand that, okay, as a black woman, African, and then I speak Zulu or Sotho. But here we see you doing what is needed, that for us to identify ourselves and take a stand and allow God to use us. And the reason about the land is an issue. 76, we're all crazy, land issue and, activism and all that, but still, it's still an issue. A land in South Africa, a land everywhere. What can we do better to address the issue of land? Because it's a recurring dismal. Our children, our great-grandchildren, they know that the minute you want to wake up, you say the land, they've taken the land, and you don't want to share, you don't want to allow yourself and think positively or think that we can live together, we can. So I think if you can unpack it for us as lay people, thank you, appreciate it, God bless you.
At the back, it's yours. Do you want to answer that, or are you okay? It's a comment.
I want to make one small comment. Dr. Tabile and I began our friendship and our conversation in the mosque. The two of us Christians were brought together in the wonderful mosque where we began talking, and part of that conversation were our Muslim brothers and sisters. It's an ongoing conversation. I think that really to learn how to share is essential to our vocation to be human beings. It reminds me of the prayer of Pope Francis in June 2014, when he said, in the presence of the Palestinian president and the Israeli prime minister, he said, is the Israeli president, sorry, not the prime minister, he deliberately didn't invite the prime minister, the president. He said, we turn our eyes heavenward in an act of supreme responsibility. to realize that we have a common Father who is looking on us as God's children, teaching us how to share.
Our last input.
Thank you. I'm Terry Shakanowski, also a Jewish white South African. And my question is prompted by you talking about what South Africa has to teach, the experience of Palestinians and Israelis. Because, I feel if there's one thing we learned in our non-racial struggle, it was again and again that common humanity trumped identification with ethnicity. It wasn't only dissident white Afrikaners, it was leaders and activists, across the spectrum. But my experience of the Jewish community since October 7 has shaken to the absolute core that notion of a common humanity. Because what I have seen is that many people who would, in a South African context, certainly have been anti-apartheid, left-wing, committed activists, some of them. Certainly people committed to charitable acts, one of whom, for example, runs a soup kitchen from her own garage, but have come out very fiercely in favor of what Israel is currently doing. And the parallels that seem so obvious to some of us about, suffering, etc., are not apparent to them either. And so what does one appeal to in that situation? I'm asking you as a priest and as a spiritual leader, if it's not, I'm questioning that very notion of a common humanity that you and other speakers have spoken to.
I think how you respond to that will be your closing remarks as well, because it will send us into the world to be Leaven, right?
So Terry, I hear the despair. I hear it from you, I hear it from my mother, I hear it from a number of other Jewish friends, some of whom are here, some of whom are not here. And I identify with it as a Jewish white South African. I might be a Roman Catholic priest, but at the core, I'm still a Jewish white South African. I think that we need to continue speaking, acting. We need to keep on witnessing, a very Christian word, but when I say witnessing, means that there is a little seed growing. I don't know if you see it like I see it, but I see that there is awakening up. Awakening up in a situation, Jewish white South Africans live in a world very far away from Palestine. I'm sure many of them have never met a Palestinian. They have been convinced by the institutions that run Jewish South African life that the world's a dangerous place. We must stay in the lager, protect ourselves, that any expression of the sentiments that you just have courageously said is a danger to the community. And again, I think that the voices are slowly popping out. People are breaking through that. There is Jews for a Free Palestine, there is the United Jewish Initiative, what's it called? The United Jewish Initiative? Democratic Jewish Initiative. There are voices, and I'd like to believe that it's growing slowly. It needs to. As many brave Jewish people have said in the last 2 years, like Peter Beinart, like Yuval Noah Harari, the survival of the Jewish people, the survival of Jewish civilization depends on being able to look critically at ourselves and realize that, and this is Avram Burg who says, realize that we have become our own worst enemy. So, closing words of enormous gratitude to all of you that you have come out on this stormy evening, although I think God has smiled on us and has not sent the thunder and lightning that was promised for this evening.
You are favored.
I want to point out something else that, and this again is thanks to Rob Riedlinger, who was an incredibly important part of producing the book. Rob not only convinced me that the name of the book should be Conquest or Leaven, but convinced me that this is a process. It's not just a book to read and then put down, but a process of conversation that needs to be ongoing among all of us. And so Rob is inaugurating a website together with me, but certainly Rob is the mastermind behind the website. And the website seeks to put out more information, more food for thought, but also cinema, Israeli-Palestinian cinema, literature, works of poetry, writing on Palestine, Israel that can open us up to this reality. With always what is in mind is we're not trying to turn you into experts on Palestine, Israel, but what does Palestine, Israel as a case say about the universal? And how then can it be applied? And I can't do that work, but how then can that be applied as we grow in sensitivity to the tensions that tear us apart? How can we grow in awareness to become agents in our society of equality, justice and peace, pardon and reconciliation here in South Africa, that leaven that is constantly at work. Thank you very much.